Alternate history videos on YouTube, like most of alternate history, is based on theoretical and often fantastical what-if scenarios, springing from key historical turning points. The most common example is, what if Germany won World War II? These videos can be fun, counterfactual exercises in fiction writing, and they are fun. It's fine to have fun with them. However, a lot of them also have sinister and understated backsides. To understand this, and to understand alternate history, you first have to be equipped to understand history. Part 1. The Objective Historian. History is not past events. History isn't even a retelling of past events. History is a story, a narrative. It's written by historians investigating sources, who look at these sources in an attempt to decipher what is the story here. They compile the knowledge gained from these sources and try to extract that story. Two historians working with the exact same sources might come away from them with a completely different read on the situation, due to emphasizing some sources over others or simply asking different questions. Because of this, historians have to be conscious about their biases and motivations as they interrogate historical sources. There's no such thing as a perfectly objective historian. The historian that's most convinced they are objective is the least trustworthy historian. The one conscious of the biases is the one you should trust. The narrative forged from these historical sources is incredibly powerful, capable of completely reshaping the way we understand the world. Because of this, history is, in my mind, not only a tool for propaganda, it is, in and of itself, propaganda. To give an example, much history has been written about the American Civil War, and for a time, in some areas, the prevailing historical narrative was that the US Civil War was fought to safeguard the rights of states to legislate their own policy without interference from the federal government. In some circles, this is still the prevailing narrative. You can arrive at this conclusion if you exclusively rely on sources that seek to emphasize these aspects in propaganda during the war, or in propaganda after the war that sought to rationalize and whitewash the Confederate cause. The accepted historical account, however, is that the American Civil War was sparked by the South seceding in order to protect the economic interests of slave owners. Another example might be the story of Christopher Columbus's discovery of the Americas, which in history textbooks, even in Norway when I was growing up, did not adequately account for the utter depopulation of the Caribbean that his greed-fueled slave venture caused. He is characterized as a skilled navigator who sought to find lucrative trade routes for his country, instead of an entrepreneurial, slave-owning proto-capitalist who believes that he was personally chosen by God to bring about the end times by earning enough money for the Spanish crown to fund a new crusade of the Holy Land. I am not making any of this up. My point being that even if either of these accounts are more correct by the standards of historians in their fields, they are nonetheless neither objective nor factual retelling of events, because none of the historians writing these things were there. They are narratives based on available sources, attempting as much as possible to reach some semblance of historical truth that can never quite be achieved. Because it can never be quite achieved, there's never such a thing as a concrete final narrative of history on any subject. This is the one thing historians have going for them in terms of job security. So now that we've established that history is written from the point of view of a person with biases, relying on a selection of sources written by people with biases, let's get into alternate history. Part 2. Constructing reality. Alternate history is fiction, but it's fiction that operates on the pretense of being based in some sort of analysis of reality. There's an inciting event or a key turning point, the point of divergence from our timeline into the alternate history timeline. Or more often, in fact, authors work backwards from the reality they want to construct, towards a point where maybe that reality could have become real. An example is Harry Turtledove's Southern Victory, where Turtledove starts with a question: what if the South won the war? And then works back from that and tries to find a way that they could have won. However, the instances in history where the outcomes come down to a single event are few and far between. Usually a particular event's occurrence is contingent on a multitude of passive enabling factors, and then it additionally requires a number of active factors, like the actions of people in the moment. These things intuitively make sense, of course, but it's important to understand how authors of alternate history aren't predicting certain outcomes based on factors in their alternate history timeline. They're instead writing towards those outcomes. Like most authors, they have an idea of where the story needs to go and are working their way towards that, even long before the point of divergence. As an author, they are the master of their reality that they are constructing, and every action and event in this reality flows from their imagination, their worldview, their ideals, and experiences. So when an author is writing a work of alternate history or any other form of fiction, or actual history itself, we always have to interrogate what the author is trying to convey with their work, what are the themes and messages the author wants us to walk away with once we're done inhabiting their world or reading their text. Part 3. The Thesis. All works of fiction and all works of history have a message they wish to impart, an idea they wish to convey, or an argument they want to persuade you to accept. Sometimes these things are communicated subtly through a work's themes, or, as is in the case of works of history, overtly in the form of direct argumentation. This makes many of these works have propagandistic elements, as I mentioned. This doesn't mean they're all sinister, but that they are trying to influence the way you think and see the world, just as I'm doing with this video. Let's illustrate an example of how quickly an author's thesis can be identified and how quickly it can start the alt history scenario off on a very shaky ground. Here's a video from a channel called Monsieur C, or Monsieur Z, or Monsieur Z, I don't know. Before I talk more about this guy, Mr. Z, let me play a very short clip from his video. The name of the video is What If the Bay of Pigs invasion succeeded?
Support for him encouraged him to step down and ultimately granted recognition to the newly formed government of Fidel Castro, not realizing Castro carried deeply anti-American sentiments and was becoming increasingly sympathetic to communist ideals. The breaking point came with the warming of Cuban relations with the Soviet Union and the nationalization of American-owned industries within Cuba. Then President Dwight Eisenhower felt that enough was enough and prepared an operation to remove Castro from power.
So what's wrong with this foundational part of his alternate history scenario? Monsieur Z has left out a significant part of the story. Let's lay down the timeline. In 1959, the military dictator Batista was overthrown in a democratic revolution that sought to restore the 1940 constitution, which Batista had annulled after his 1952 coup. In 1959, after the revolution, the new Cuban government began instituting land reform, aimed at democratizing the agrarian economy. One of the ways they did this was by eliminating the ability for small subset of people to own large swaths of land, and instead granted ownership of this land to the workers who had been working it. In so doing, they confiscated a lot of land which was held by foreign companies. This worsened relations between the United States and Cuba, and by April of 1960, the US State Department had formulated a plan to attempt to oust the new Cuban government. In its proposed plan, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs said the following to the Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs, while acknowledging a majority support for the Cuban government. Oh, and even before that, by the way, in March 1960, the CIA had already begun preparing to overthrow the Cuban government. Anyways, here's the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs. The only foreseeable means of alienating internal support is through disenchantment and disaffection based on economic dissatisfaction and hardship, and he recommended a policy that would deny money and supplies to Cuba, to decrease monetary and real wages, to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of government. In May 1960, Cuba began purchasing arms from the Soviet Union because the US insisted on maintaining its arms embargo on Cuba that had begun under Batista. In July 1960, the US reduced the amount of sugar it was buying from Cuba, so the Soviet Union started buying Cuban sugar instead. In June 1960, the US stopped exporting oil to Cuba, so the Cubans started buying Soviet crude oil. However, Cuba lacked any way to refine the oil, since the US-owned refineries on Cuba refused to refine Soviet oil. So Cuba nationalized the oil refineries without compensation. In response, the US announced an embargo on all trade to Cuba, except for food and medicine. In October 1960, Cuba nationalized most US-owned businesses and property on the island. In January 1961, the United States severed all diplomatic ties to Cuba. And then finally, in April 1961, the CIA trained Cuban exiles, utilizing US B-26 bombers to soften up the beachhead, attempted and failed in their Bay of Pigs invasion. December 1961, Fidel Castro declares himself a Marxist-Leninist and a socialist. The United States has officially shot itself in the foot by pushing Cuba further towards Soviet alignment, when perhaps there was room for peaceful coexistence of Cuban land reform and economic justice in Cuba, and American capitalism in America. So it's clear, Monsieur Z's thesis here is to say Cuba bad because communism, just as I hope it's abundantly clear that my thesis in the previous section was to say post-revolutionary Cuba did a lot of good, and Cuba's alignment with the Soviet Union must in part be blamed on strategic missteps by the United States, who could have had a friendly Cuba. Now, just to clarify, an author having a bias is usually not a problem. A good author is aware of their biases and message of their work, and those who are consuming the work are also aware of these things. However, in some situations, the author isn't trained to be acutely aware of these things, or in the worst case scenario, they are, and consciously hiding their motivation behind their work. Monsieur Z is probably both. He makes content that's overtly far-right, and he doesn't seem to have a firm grasp of history. In these situations, what might on the surface seem to be a benign piece of alternate history could be a veiled attempt at propagandizing deeply problematic worldviews or deeply flawed ideas about history. This can be especially damaging if the thesis of the historian, almost said alt-right historian, builds off of outright nonsense and ahistorical perspectives or ideas, because a person producing the work doesn't actually understand history. To give an example, it would be like me, a person with no training or experience in city planning or urban development, submitting my roadway infrastructure proposal to the Oslo city government in the form of a hastily drawn JPEG. If someone else who is untrained in these things wants to look at that without any pushback from someone who knows what they're talking about, they might actually get the incredibly stupid idea that building a 7-lane highway is going to alleviate traffic. Because the author is the master of the reality they construct, it is vitally important that when consuming alternate history on YouTube especially, that you interrogate the author's assumptions and views. And if you know their worldview, attempt to understand how it may affect or otherwise skew the content they're creating. There's no such thing as apolitical history. If anyone tells you that they are apolitical and then go on to present their theory for how the Nazis could have won World War II, then get out while you still can.